Okay, the reading for this week is Matsuo Bashō's Oku no Hosomichi, probably one of the most famous works of Japanese literature, written in 1689, published posthumously after his death in 1694. Okay, and this is the second Matsuo Bashō Haibun, or Kikobun, travel journal work that we'll be reading. So you should already be somewhat familiar with the genre. This is the fifth and last of his Kikobun that he wrote. Okay, so refer to that previous study guide sheet before reading this. Okay, so Matsuo Bashō's Oku no Hosomichi, the English translation. It's been translated numerous times. One of the translations, or the one we'll be using for the foreign students, is The Narrow Road to the Deep North. Okay, and I have the link there. It's translated by David Landis Barnhill, whose translation I think is the best translation so far. Donald Keene also translated it. Numerous others have done it. McCulloch and Stephen Carter did a translation several decades ago. But this, I think, is the best one. And I also have the original Japanese at the bottom of the study guide, so you can refer to that as you read it. And I also have a link there to the Kadokawa Bunko paperback version. You can buy that too. And those usually have the footnotes and whatnot. But your English translation also has the footnotes. So make sure you refer to the footnotes as you read it. Okay. So I think we have 21 questions for this work. It's a very dense work, so there's a lot to discuss and think about here. Before we jump into the study questions, first we have the particularities of culture, the terms, place names, titles, literary figures, historical figures, and so forth. And this list is not comprehensive, so you'll want to add to it as you read. Okay. So first we have a brief introduction to the poet and the Haibun prose writer Matsuo Bashō, born in 1644, died in 1694 at the age of 50. So he was fairly young, and you see that he's starting to suffer from stomach ailments already at this point in this work in his mid-40s. So he was not very healthy. But he nevertheless decided to go on these travels through the north. Okay, the most famous poet of the High Edo period. The Edo period, of course, is the period lasting from 1603 to 1867, followed by the modern period, the Meiji period, right? The period of modernization, westernization, and so forth. During his lifetime, Bashō is best known for his works in the collaborative Haikai Renga form. Today, however, he's recognized as a master of the single stanza hokku, or what is today called haiku. Okay, so there's a tendency to misread him in the modern period, to think of him exclusively as a haiku poet. But he's much, much more than that, as this work and the work we read last week, Nozarashi Kiko, show. Okay, Oku no Hosomichi is what we're reading today. This is his major work of haibun, right, or haikai prose, and the last of his 5 poetic travel journals, or kikobun. Okay. And I have notes about those two terms, haibun and kikobun, in the previous study guide. The work is a fictional account based on an actual journey. Okay, so it's an actual journey. He actually did make these travels, but do not read it in the autobiographical mode, which has been a tendency for a long time, right? So we conflate the narrator poet with Bashō himself. But Bashō is obviously performing a role. He's embellishing. He sees himself in terms of the long tradition of Japanese poetry. So he's fictionalizing a lot of this stuff. So be sure not to read it in the purely autobiographical mode. That's an important point to think about as you read it. After departing from Ueno, so Ueno's, now it's in Tokyo, of course, but it was just on the outskirts of Edo at the time, and the area Yanaka, which is right next to Ueno, near Edo, in late spring 1689. Okay, so they depart from Ueno and Yanaka in late spring 1689. Bashō and his travel companion Sora travel through the following. Okay, and I made my own list as I read of the places that he goes through, and there are more. Okay, and I haven't filled out the details, so I want you to fill out the descriptions and add any important place names that appear as you read it. These are the major ones, so you should keep in the back of your head as you read it a general idea of his location at any particular moment in the text. Okay, so he starts from Ueno, he goes up to Senju, which is on the outskirts of Tokyo, of Edo, goes through Nikko, Shirakawa Barrier. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole list. Sendai on the Kaga province. And keep in mind, province is the word for kuni, right? In the old system, an area was called a kuni, so Kaga no kuni. And today this is ken, Ishikawa ken. So in most cases I give both the old name, the kyume, the province name, Kaga kuni, and the contemporary name. So memorize these two as much as you can. Okay, Kanagawa, he basically leaves Edo, goes up to the north all the way to Yamagata, where my wife is from, up in the Tohoku region, to the far, far outskirts of Japan, all the way to the far north, and then comes back along the Nihonkai and ends up, in the final scene, we see him heading to Ise Jingu on the 6th day of the 9th month. Okay, so he starts in late spring, and we end in the 9th month. And keep in mind, the 9th month is not September. We'll review that once again in the study questions section. Okay, this list is not exhaustive. Add to the list and fill in the details as you read, I say there. Okay, next we have Sora. I have a brief description about his travel companion, Sora, his disciple, okay, and travel companion. He's also the author of Sora Tabi Nikki, which was written around the same time, a few years after this was written, and it gives a very, very different portrait of Matsuo Bashō, and it was forgotten or lost for centuries, and it was rediscovered at the height of the war in 1943, and it provides a very, it was sort of shocking to those who assumed that the character, that the persona in this work is the same as Bashō. So we get a very different Bashō that's usually depicted. I have a brief note here about the Kikobun genre of travel writings, which has its roots in Tosa Nikki, written in the Heian period, classical times. So we see this genre appear in the classical times and continue all throughout the medieval period, and Bashō sort of revives it here in the Edo period. And I have a list of the various works in that genre. Haikai Denga. Okay, I have a note about Haikai Denga. You can read it for yourself, but it's basically non-standard Denga, right? Denga is linked verse. Okay, linked verse was very popular in the medieval period, right? And it was mainly limited to the aristocracy or the bushi class, right? So the high-ranking samurai would participate in it through the medieval period. In the Edo period, we see the invention of sort of standard print, right? So a large swath of the population is suddenly able to read things that they hadn't been able to read before, right? And you see the diffusion of literacy. So we have Renga becoming popularized. Zokuka is Ishikawa Jun's word for it. So, and Matsuo Bashō is coming out of this new context of popularization, of the diffusion of literacy and publication methods. So he's writing in the old Renga form, but it's more sort of vulgarized, I guess you could say, or commonized, right? So it's Haikai Renga, which is non-standard or unorthodox Renga. Okay, but it's in the same line. So you see Waka is the origins of Japanese poetry. Waka develops into linked verse of Renga, and then Renga develops into Haikai Renga. And Matsuo Bashō, of course, is part of that Haikai Renga tradition. Okay, although the work we're reading today does not have linked verse, right? We're in the world of Haibun, which is literally Haikai writings. Okay, a literary genre that combines diaristic prose and Haikai poetry. So it's a combination of prose and poetry. Okay, this term is first used by Bashō in 1690. And then I have a note about Kikobun. I mentioned that above. Okay, on to priest Saigyo. Okay, so Matsuo Bashō sees himself in terms of this Sino-Japanese poetic tradition, and he often compares himself to Saigyo, or thinks he is Saigyo, or at least sort of half-ironically compares himself to Saigyo, the major poet and Buddhist priest of the late Heian period, whose lives and works became the subject of numerous no plays, joruri puppet dramas, legends, setsuwa anecdotes, and so forth. I'm not going to read the whole note about Saigyo, you can read it there, but keep in mind that Bashō often refers to Saigyo, and he considers himself as sort of a modern-day Saigyo figure. He also considers himself a modern-day Dufu figure, right? The leading Tang Dynasty Chinese poet, whose work greatly influenced Bashō and other poets. Okay, another term there, Karo Tosen. So I discussed last time, sort of a Buddhist or Taoist inflected term, meaning useless things, a hot furnace in summer. a cooling fan in winter. Okay, you can read that. Kokin Wakashu is referred to in this work. Kokin Wakashu, or a collection of poems, ancient and modern, compiled or finished in 905, so in the beginning of the Heian period, or almost mid-Heian period, first quarter of the Heian period. It's the first of the 21 imperially commissioned anthologies of classical Japanese poetry. Contains 1,111 poems, mostly waka, and it became sort of the standard for classical poetry, and Matsuo Bashō refers to it and alludes to it in this work as well. Man-yōshū is also referred to in this work. This is the earliest compilation of classical Japanese poetry. It contains over 4,500 poems, and it is cited throughout Oku no Hosomichi. Okay, the last poem here was written in the 756, so this precedes the Heian period. This is the Nara period. Okay, several other figures, historical figures, and priests. For example, priest Noin is alluded to in or cited in Matsuo Bashō's work. The Tang Dynasty Chinese poet Bai Jiaowei, whose famous poem "A Song of Ending Sorrow" or Changhenge we already read for this class, one of the first assignments that we did, published in written in 806. I have the link there for my study guide and recitation of that poem, which is cited in this work as well. Dogen is referred to, and Minamoto no Yoshitsune, so figures who were associated or involved in the Genpei wars of the late Heian period are alluded to throughout this work. Okay, so note, this list is not comprehensive. There are many more important references. As you read, add to this list and fill out the details. Okay, so that's the end of the particularities of culture list that I have. Now on to the study questions. Okay, first, question number 1. Make a map of Bashō's and Sora's journey, starting with their departure from Ueno, Yanaka, and Senju, near Edo, in late spring 1689. Look up the more important place names and take note of their associations. Okay, it's easy to be overwhelmed at the beginning when you first read this. I think first time I read it, I was very confused to know what was going on because there are so many place names. So it's important to learn how to distinguish between those that are very important, that tell you the general area of Japan that he's in at the moment, and those that are just like a name of a small path along a mountainside that nobody knows. Okay, so it's important to just identify the important ones, write those down, and give descriptions if possible. Note the seasons and the seasonal transitions, okay? So it's very important to note which season we're in at the time, and he gives little hints. The narrator poet sometimes explicitly states the season or month, but sometimes he does not. What clues does he give for conveying the season? Okay. Number 2, does the work employ any symbols or metaphors? Okay, this is something that's not really talked about when early modern Japanese haibun or haikai poetry is discussed, but this idea of symbols. Some people claim that there are no metaphors in traditional Japanese poetry or in later unorthodox Japanese poetry, but I think this is wrong or misguided. For example, the road, the michi, that Matsuo Bashō and his companion travel along, can this be read as a metaphor for something? Obviously, it is a road, of course, that they go along, and there are many roads that they travel along, but it's more than that. It's a symbolic kind of road, I think. And if my theory is right, what does this road represent? Okay, also consider the metaphoric possibilities of the following: the journey itself, the tabi, right? It is a tabi, but it's also something more than that, right? I think you can read it in a metaphorical register. The surviving ancient pine tree that we see at one point in this work. Okay, I think this is a symbol for the ancient world, Kodai, right, that he seeks. Okay, so one of the motivations or purposes for his journey is to seek the ancient world, right? And he sees the pine tree that's 1,000 years old, and he sees it as kind of a symbol for something that survived into the present, the continuity of the past into the present. Okay, the Shirakawa barrier, Shirakawa no Seki, itself appears in this work, right, in the, I think, page 4 or 5 or so, toward the beginning. And it is one of the 3 great barriers of Japan, beyond which lies the otherworldly Michinoku, or the deep north. Okay, and the barrier is obviously a physical barrier, but it's also something more than that. It's the division, the dividing line between two worlds, right? The world of the Michinoku up north and the world of Edo, where Bashō lives, and which is the sort of the seat of the government at the time, the Bakufu, and so forth. So this world of unreal world in the north, this sort of spiritual, well, that's the next question here, leads to this. The Michinoku is it's the geographical location of Japan, but it's also, in my view, something more than that. Okay, discuss what it is more in this metaphorical register. And it's, in my view, or not in my view, I think it's pretty obvious, it's associated with the spiritual, with the gods, with a sense of foreboding too. So you notice that the higher up he goes, the further north he goes, farther north he goes, the more perilous things become, the more afraid he is, the chances of death increase. Okay, it's also associated with the past, the ancient past, antiquity. It's rustic yet cultivated. So you notice that he doesn't just find uneducated farmers and so forth as he goes north. He finds these rustics, but they're cultivated too. They participate in haikai. They have haikai circles. They do poetry and so forth. It's also for him a possible place to die, right? He mentions death several times in the beginning, sort of foreshadowing his own death. Ultimately, he doesn't die, and he's surprised to find he doesn't die at the end of it. But it's a place that's associated with death in some ways. It's primordial, right, as opposed to modern or contemporary for him, Edo. And all this is, of course, in implicit contrast to the contemporary metropolis Edo, which is at the time I think by the year 1700, the city of Edo was the largest metropolis or city, urban center in the world. Okay, and we're in right now late 1680s, so we're almost there. Okay, so Edo is this huge, sprawling, urban metropolis that represents, in Bashō's mind, modernity for him at least. Right, contemporary world, the seat of the Tokugawa Bakufu government, right? And to leave that world and go north is to go into the past, okay? And you see this structure, by the way, in Kawabata Yasunari's Yukiguni, right? He leaves Tokyo, which is the center of modernity, symbol of modernity, and he goes up north, leaving modernity behind, and the further up he goes into the past. And there's also a kind of Shirakawa barrier in that too, right? The tunnel. その長いトネル抜けると雪国であった is the first sentence of that word. Okay. Question number 3. What are the purposes and motivations for his trip? Okay, so why does he go on this trip in the first place? He's sick. He should probably just stay home and relax and try to recover from his illness. But he doesn't. Some of the hints I'll give you. Aching for the past. Kodai o motomete. To see into the hearts of the ancients is a quote from the text. To discover places that reveal the duration of the past into the present. Okay, and Sora, his travel companion, writes a poem explicitly about this, a hokku, about the silkworm tenders that they encounter in Yamagata, who are, for him, represent this continuity of the past into the present. Okay, and another motivation is to enter the extratemporal space of the poetic tradition. Okay, so to leave time itself and to go commune with the other poets, commune with past poets, to flee reality. So there's a bit of genjitsu tohi element in this as well, right? To sort of leave reality and go into this world, this unreal world, to cure the sense of restlessness that bothers him, right? We see that in the opening passage. He's constantly bothered by the sense of restlessness, of this kind of Wanderlust, right? To experience danger, okay, so Michinoku is associated with danger as well, to prepare for death, to prepare himself for death, and last but not least, to compose poetry, to be inspired to compose poetry, and by writing excellent poetry to gain eternal fame. Okay, so these are some of the motivations that I think drive him, and you could glean these motivations from the text itself, but there might be more. So if you find any more, if you want to elaborate on any of these, do so in your answer to that question. Okay, number 4. Note the inclusion, this is just a minor point here, but something I noticed. Note the inclusion of diaristic fragments within the larger Kikobun narrative. So the Kikobun genre itself is a journal, right? He's keeping a journal as he's going on this journey. But within the journal, we see other diaristic fragments that he takes out And it kind of reminded me of the modernist novels of André Gide, for example, or Nagai Kafu, the modernist 20th century Japanese novelist who was very influenced by André Gide. So I explained this almost proto-modernist technique that Matsuo Bashō uses. He's keeping a journal, but then he takes out fragments from another journal and throws it into his main journal. Okay, and we see this, for example, in his musings on the kanji etymology of the word chestnut, right? And the poem, I Scribbled Down These Words, is that section there. Number 5, discuss this profound and moving hokku that the narrator poet composes just after passing through the Shirakawa barrier. Okay, the Shirakawa barrier is the barrier that represents, or that divides these two worlds, the Michinoku, unreal world up in the north, and reality of Edo down below. And the poem that I found very profound and moving is the following: Furyu no hajime ya oku no taue uta. Okay, Furyu no hajime ya oku no taue uta. The beginning of all art. So the translator here translates Furyu as all art, but it means something more like stylishness or sophistication or aesthetic taste, all of these sort of things. The beginning of all art, in the deep north, a rice planting song. Okay, which is a very interesting and moving poem. What is the poet, or the narrator poet here, trying to say about the common source of all art, all aesthetic cultivation, or Furyu, both high and low? Okay, so Matsuo Bashō, of course, comes out of a world of high culture, right? He's trained in the classics. He knows Chinese poetry. He's coming out of the Renga tradition of linked verse and so forth, right? So there's a tendency in classical poetry to look down on the rustics up in the north. But you don't see him looking down on the rustics up in the north here. He's saying that the source of their art is the source of my art, I think. Okay, is he suggesting that both high culture and low culture spring from the same source? So this peasant woman or man, it doesn't say, singing a peasant song as they plant their rice seeds, right? He's saying, I am you, sort of, I think. All right, but that's sort of my reading of that scene, of that poem, hokku. What is yours? Okay, number 6. There's a general question about this narrator poet, right? Who is he? Okay, obviously he's Matsuo Bashō's creation, but what can we glean about his character and about his personality from his prose passages? From his hokku, what can we glean about his character and personality? Is this narrator poet the same persona that we encountered in Nozarashi Kiko, the journal of bleached bones in a field, written 5 years earlier? Explain. Okay, so it's a general question about this character. Number 7 now. Note the depictions of nature and the landscape scenes. Note the waterfalls, the caves, the boulders, the seascapes, the beach scenes, and so forth. Note the unreal, spiritual, or supernatural qualities that often seem to pervade these natural phenomena. Are the sites always famous places, or meisho? Okay, that's an important literary term that you should know. Meisho. And poetic topoi, uta makura, literally poem pillows. So uta makura are set places that poets usually discuss or write about when they're writing poetry. Sort of conventional topoi. Do any of the passages resemble Chinese landscape paintings? Okay, so some of these passages I think do, and you can talk about this in your answer. Can you find in these depicted scenes any tenkei jinbutsu? So this is a term I had on the last study guide as well. Tenkei jinbutsu is a term from Chinese and Japanese art, referring to the tiny background human figures or animals that are added as secondary elements to a landscape painting. So a lot of times in Japanese or Chinese landscape paintings, in the far background you see a tiny, tiny human figure. Okay, and it seems like he's imagining those sorts of landscape paintings as he's making some of his descriptions here. Explain. Okay, so that's a question about the natural depictions here. And at the beginning I forgot to mention that a lot of times, and especially in relation to this Oku no Hosomichi work, Matsuo Bashō is referred to as a nature poet. And a lot of people say, oh, he's a beautiful poet who's in touch with nature, and he does lovely descriptions of landscapes and so forth. It's important to note here that he is not a nature poet, right? Everything he writes about is not just nature as such. It's sort of acculturated nature. Nature that is inscribed with human meaning and culture and art and poetry and so forth. So it's wrong and misguided, I think, to think of him in terms of a nature poet. He's not a... Nature didn't really exist for the Japanese before the Meiji period, right? Nature existed only insofar as it related to the poetic or the artistic or literary tradition. Okay. That's just something always to keep in mind when you're reading anything written before 1890 or so. And that general point relates to the next question, question number 8. Make a list of the classical, literary, cultural, and historical references that appear in the work, both Chinese and Japanese. I started the list above, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Describe the function and significance of these allusions in the context of the work. How many allusions involve something from the Heian period? Okay, the golden age of Japan's aristocratic culture. So I think in the other work, Nozarashi Kiko, we didn't see many allusions to the Heian period. We saw, well, I guess, Saigyo, which is after the Heian period, or late Heian. But not a lot to the Genpei Wars, for example. But we do see a lot of that here. Why do we see a lot of Heian references here? How many of the references involve, say, the powerful Fujiwara family? So the Fujiwara family is the great, powerful family of the aristocracy in the Heian period. And we also see references to the rival Heike, or Taira, and Minamoto, or Genji clans, right? And they had the famous Genpei Wars that ended with the Minamoto's victory, right? And the ascension of the Genji clan into the following subsequent periods, right? And the end of the Taira clan. Okay, so explain all of these references that appear in the text, both Chinese and Japanese. Okay. Question number 9 is about Bashō's companion, Sora. What is his background? How many of his hokku compositions are included in the work? Can we discern anything about the man from his poems? Do Sora and Bashō ever split up in the work? If so, where? Do they reunite? Explain. So I think in Nozarashi Kiko, we also saw Bashō's, the narrator poet, split up with his companion at one point. I think we see something similar here. Where do they split up here? If so, why? Where? Explain the circumstances and explain their reunion at the end. I just gave away the answer to that last question, but that's okay. Number 10. Compare Bashō's notion of the task or the role of the poet with the modern romantic conception of poetry. Okay? So how is Bashō's conception of what the poet is and what the poet should do different from the modern idea of what the poet is and what the poet should do? And the modern conception of poetry comes primarily from the romantic idea of the artist, right? The romantic idea of the artist, of the poet, as someone who expresses himself, who asserts himself. The goal of art, according to the romantic idea, is self-expression and self-assertion. How is that different from Matsuo Bashō's idea of self-abandonment, right? And I think the term self-abandonment appears at several instances in this work, in the English translation. Self-dissolution. Okay, so not in contrast to self-assertion, we see self-dissolution. The idea of immersing oneself in the ancient past and in the timeless poetic tradition. Okay, so that's Bashō's view. How is that different than the modern or the romantic view? Okay, it's more of a speculative question, a question that you need to speculate on and review the idea of the romantic poet if you're not familiar with it. Number 11. 11 is just a simple point about the months. So keep in mind that the months are given according to the traditional lunar or lunisolar calendar, the Kyureki, right? As the Japanese would call it after 1889 or whenever it was that they adopted the Western or the Gregorian calendar, which they call the Seireki, right? Okay, so everything in this work is given in the old calendar, and I have the names here. The first month is Mutsuki. Second month is Kisaragi. Third month is Yayoi. Fourth month is Uzuki, sometimes called the Dutsya month in English, name of a flower, I think. Fifth month is Satsuki. Sixth month is Minatsuki. Seventh month is Fuzuki or Fumizuki, the month of the writing letters or writing words. Eighth month is Hazuki. Ninth month is Nagatsuki. 10th month is Kannazuki, the month of no gods, literally from the kanji. 11th month is Shimotsuki, and the 12th month is Shibasu. Okay, so keep in mind those as you read. Number 12, identify the Buddhist themes, elements, and passages that appear in the work. Why do Bashō and Sora seem to fancy themselves as Buddhist monks? So in the beginning, they start with a poem where they shave their heads, right, in the tradition of the monks. Explain the Zen elements and references. For example, the image of the moon reflected in the water at Matsushima. So we see more Zen imagery, I think, than we saw in the other Nozarashi Kiko. And note, too, that Bashō himself did study Zen Buddhism under his Zen master Buddhō, whom he meets at one point in this work, right? And Buddhō studied under a guy named Ungo. Okay, how does the Buddhist notion of karma? Okay, in the original Japanese, the word that he gives is goin, right? But usually the word is just go or go. Suggested in his depiction of the two pilgrim prostitutes, right? So they run into two young prostitutes that are on their way to Ise Jingu, right? And he mentions the idea of goin or karma in that passage, which is a Buddhist notion, of course. How does that Buddhist worldview inform his comments about these two prostitutes, for example? Okay, number 13. Make a list of all the other characters who appear in the course of Bashō's travelers. I will start the list for you. Add to the list and fill in the details. Okay, so it's a short work, it's extremely dense, and there are many, many characters that appear throughout the work, right? And keep a list of these as you go. The native rustics and children, various monks, his Zen master Buddhō, whom I just mentioned, various friends at their farewell party, and his return party at the end, right? So keep in mind that he's performing the persona of a sort of Saigyo-like monk who has no friends, who's lonely, who lives in the woods by himself, but that's not his actual self at all, right? Matsuo Bashō is a celebrity at the time. He's the most famous poet in Japan. He's got a ton of friends. When he leaves Edo, there's a long line of people waving goodbye to him as he leaves, right? And his return party, upon his return to Edo, they throw a party for him, so he's super popular. And which is why wherever he goes, even way up in the north, he has old friends living here and there, right? The local painter Kaemon, the China-inspired smiths in Dewa province. Dewa appears, right, a few times. It's part of Michinoku, the Tohoku region in the north. And Dewa no Kuni corresponds to today's Yamagata Ken, or Yamagata Prefecture, home place of my wife. Samurai named Nagayama Shigeyuki appears, a physician. The prostitutes, a merchant. Issho, the talented amateur poet who died young. The hot springs master Kumenosuke and his amateur haikai poet father. An abbot old friend named Tenryuji. And finally at the very end we have a clownish recluse named Tosai and his wife. And he spends 2 nights in the 8th month with them. And there are many, many others. Add to that list and fill out the details. Okay. Number 14. Make a list of all the animals, birds included, that appear in the work. Okay, are they associated with a specific season? For example, the hototogise, or cuckoo bird, is a season word. It's a kigo for summer. Okay, so whenever you see a hototogise mentioned, even though hototogise obviously are alive and live in other seasons, they're always associated in classical poetry and in haikai poetry of the early modern or Edo period, associated with summer. Okay, explain the context in which the other animals appear and their significance. And note if they are kigo. Number 15. How does the narrator poet view and depict the deep north, Michinoku, which includes Yamagata, Aizu no Kuni, which is today's Fukushima Ken, where the nuclear disaster was a few years ago. At the end of his trip, the poet narrator says he feels as if I had returned from the dead. Why does he say this? Why does he associate the Michinoku with the dead? What does this statement reveal about his view of the Michinoku? What are the classical literary precedents for poetic journeys to the north? Okay, this is something you might have to look into. You might not find it, but Matsuo Bashō is not the first Japanese poet to leave the capital, go north and wander around the rustic areas in the provinces, writing poems, right? Okay, I guess some of that question can be answered in the by relating it to this genre of the kikobun, but There's some other instances that I haven't mentioned yet. Number 16. Note how mitate. Okay, this is a word that was on your previous study guide. Mitate. Literally seen by comparison. This is a very important aesthetic or art word, or art and literary word that appears in discussions of Edo art a lot. So note how mitate functions in this work. Okay, mitate literally seen by comparison, and it means a kind of double vision allusions or analogical figuration. Okay, so seeing one thing through another. I think on the last video, the example I gave is my kids, right, age 3 and 1, and a baby, but the baby's not participating in that yet. But the kids, I take them to the park, we walk around, and they see everything through the world of Super Mario Brothers, right? So we go to the pond, and they think we're in the ocean where the fish swim, and you go down and see the squids and so forth, right? So they're experiencing our walk through the pond analogically, through analogical figuration, right? And this is exactly what the Edo poets, and before that really, all the way dating back to the classical period, do. They see the world that's in front of them, the immediate contemporary world, they see it analogically, through their analogical imaginations, right? So make a list of all the analogical figuration that appears in this work. One example, he runs into a hermit monk, and they talk for a while, and he describes the monk in terms of the priest Gyogi from the Nara period. So almost 1,000 years before he's writing this, he thinks of Gyogi, the famous priest from the Nara period, and compares the monk who's in front of his eyes to that ancient priest. Right? Another example, Matsushima. He sees it and he says it's the most beautiful spot in all of Japan. But he's not just describing the spot as it appears to him right there. He's describing it through the mediation of the famous poetic landscape from China. Okay. Example 3 is Kisakata, is in present-day Akita-ken, and Mount Chokai-san, is near in Yamagata, and he sees these two areas in terms of the famed West Lake or Dongting Lake in China. Okay, so he's seen things through the mediation of classical, either Chinese or Japanese, precedents. Okay, add to this list. There are many others. How does the narrator, poet, seek to unify reality and ideal, past and present, tradition and contemporary world, high culture and low culture, through the means of writing haikai and writing haibun? Okay, so that's sort of one of the goals of his haibun, to unify, to bring the past into the present, to bring the present world into the past, to unify these two worlds. Okay, number 17. What moves the narrator poet to tears? Make a list of all the sights and phenomena that move him and describe his various responses. And note again that what moves him is always a combination of things. It's never just the immediate present experience. He'll never look at a mountain and say, oh my God, that's so moving, I'm going to cry and write a poem about it. No. He always sees that it's the immediate present experience plus the associations from classical texts, right? So it's always a combination of the two. Associations from classical or previous stories, previous poems that it evokes. Okay, an example that I have here on your study guide, he sees a boat being pulled by a bunch of fishermen. By itself, he would not be moved by that. Okay, by itself, it probably wouldn't even enter his vision. Okay, but it enters his vision and it moves him because there is a poem in the Kokinshu, the classical anthology that I mentioned in the key terms above, about a similar phenomenon. Okay, so without the Kokinshu association, he probably would not have even noticed the scene. Okay. Also note how there are sometimes 3 levels or layers of mediation. In his musings on Minamoto no Yoshitsune's demise, for example, he is moved by the immediate scene, the scene at Takadachi, which reminds him of what happened to Yoshitsune at that site, okay, back in the Heian period, which in turn reminds him of Dufu's famous poem Spring View, Chungwang, written in the wake of the disastrous An Lushan rebellion in the Tang period in China. Okay, so we have the immediate scene, which reminds him of what happened to Yoshitsune in the Heian period, which reminds him of the earlier Chinese poem, famous poem, probably the most famous poem in all Chinese classical poetry by Du Fu, called Chung Wang, or Spring View, okay, which has the following lines, which every Japanese school child knows. A country torn apart, the mountains and rivers remain. In spring, in the ruined castle, the grass is green. Okay, so the famous poem about how the war has destroyed everything, however, the mountains and the rivers are still here. Okay? Kuni yaburete is how Japanese read it in Kaki Kudashi Bun. Alright, on to number 18. Describe the narrator poet's illness. Okay, what symptoms does he suffer? What does his attitude toward his illness reveal about his character, about his personality? Note the phrase, die on the road, this is the fate of heaven. Okay? Doro ni shinnan, kore ama no inochi nari, or ten no inochi nari is the Japanese. Die on the road, this is the fate of heaven. So dying on the road is kind of a motif that you see in classical Chinese literature. You see it in Confucius, I think, in several occasions. And you see it here. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to die on the road. It seems as if the poet narrator in this work here kind of wants to die on the road. He longs to die on the road in the manner of the ancients. Okay, is he hoping to die on this journey? Because that would be the supremely poetic thing to do? Explain. Okay, this is sort of a more interpretive question. Number 19. We're almost done now. 3 more questions. Discuss the significance of the work's title, Oku no Hosomichi. Okay, although he doesn't write it in Chinese characters in the original title, well, he writes Michi in kanji, but the rest of it is not in kanji. But the characters are Oku no Hosomichi. I have them there for you. Oku plus Hoso plus Michi. So discuss the title's source, which appears in the text. Okay, so to give away the answer for that, he takes the title from a road that he encounters up in the Michinoku region. Why did he choose this road name, a road that runs from Sendai to Tagajo, or Taga Castle, as the title? Is this name, this Oku no Hosomichi, this name of the road, a metaphor for something? If so, for what? Explain. Okay, so this relates back to that original question I had earlier question about metaphors and symbols in the work. Is this title a symbol or a metaphor for something? What is its metaphoric significance? Explain. Number 20. What does Bashō regard as the most beautiful spot in all Japan? I think I mentioned it already. It's Matsushima, and he writes the famous Matsushima Ya. I think Sora might write it actually in this one. Why does he regard it as the most beautiful spot in all of Japan? And explain once again, relating to Mitate, explain how he sees and describes this spot through the mediation of classical Chinese precedents. Okay, and the final question, number 21. Analyze each hokku that appear in the text. Okay, and I'm going to make a supplementary video after finishing this, where I read all of the hokku that appear in this work. Okay, with the English in the original, and I'll give the English translation too. Analyze each hokku that appear in this work. What is the hokku's relation to the ongoing narrative, to the context in which it appears? Keep in mind that several hokku are exceedingly famous, okay? So you might have to look this up. And when I do the recitation of the hokku, I'll mention the ones that everyone knows. That make a note of these super famous hokku. How does the final hokku? Okay, and the final hokku is Yamaguri no futami ni wakare yuku aki zo. How does this final hokku echo and provide closure to the second hokku of the work? Yuku haruya tori naki uo no me wa yamida, me wa namida. Okay, so obviously the connection is the yuki akizo, which we saw in the first hokku, and here we see yuku haruya. Okay, so the seasons are passing or departing, but a different season. Explain. Okay, and then I have 3 works included in the further reading in English part. The first, obviously, is the translation that I have provided for you, which is included in Barnhill's book, Bashō's Journey, the Literary Prose of Matsuo Bashō, published in 2005, and then 2 works by Haruo Shirane, who really revolutionized Matsuo Bashō studies and the study of Edo period haikai literature and so forth. And at the very end of the work, I have a version of the original work in Japanese, Oku no Hosomichi, okay, as I mentioned, written while he was still alive, but published after his death in year 15 of the Genroku period, or 1702 in the Western calendar. Okay, and after that, okay, that's the end. All right, this is a very, very dense work. It was very confusing to me when I first read it when I was 21 or so. I didn't understand it because I didn't understand what haikai is, right? But now I think I've explained to you enough about what haikai, what nenga poetry, and what haibun prose genre, and what the kikobun journal literature is. So I think it might make some more sense to you now. All right, if you have any questions, send me an email. That is all. Goodbye.